Siberia occupies a wide span of the northern hemisphere, extending from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. It is defined less by borders than by distance. Forest gives way to tundra. Rivers run north for thousands of kilometers before reaching the Arctic Sea. In winter, much of the land remains locked in ice for months at a time. The air is dry. Sound carries differently here, flattened by cold. Snow absorbs movement and softens edges. In many regions, there are no roads that remain passable year-round. Travel depends on frozen ground, temporary tracks, or rivers that turn solid and function as highways only part of the year. This is not a single place but a system of environments shaped by latitude and continental isolation. The landmass sits far from any moderating ocean. Seasonal shifts are extreme. Summers can be warm and brief. Winters arrive early and persist. Temperatures drop not gradually but decisively. -40 degrees Celsius is not unusual in some inland basins. At those levels, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes brittle. Breath crystallizes. Despite this, Siberia has never been empty. People have lived here continuously, adapting to conditions that do not negotiate. Survival in this region is not dramatic. It is procedural. It begins with understanding where you are. Siberia is often described as a single frozen expanse, but this simplifies a region that covers more than 13 million square kilometers. It accounts for nearly 3/4 of Russia's landmass and includes forests, mountains, wetlands, river basins, and Arctic coastline. Much of it lies above the 50th parallel north, but latitude alone does not explain its climate. The defining factor is distance from the sea. Siberia sits deep within the Eurasian continent, far from ocean currents that soften seasonal extremes elsewhere. This produces a sharply continental climate. Heat builds quickly in summer and escapes just as quickly in winter. Temperature swings of more than 60 degrees Celsius across a year are common in the interior. The coldest inhabited places on Earth are found here, not because Siberia is perpetually frozen, but because its winters are prolonged, dry, and stable. In regions such as the Sakha Republic, winter air masses can remain unmixed for weeks. Cold pools settle into valleys and do not move. When this happens, temperatures fall and remain low, sometimes below -50 degrees Celsius. Yet Siberia is not uniformly cold. Summers bring thaw, insects, and plant growth. The taiga forests, which stretch across much of southern and central Siberia, are dense and biologically active for a short period each year. Rivers flood during spring melt, carrying nutrients and reshaping land that appeared static during winter. This seasonal contrast defines life here. The cold is not constant pressure but a recurring condition that structures time. People plan around freeze and thaw cycles. Infrastructure is built to accommodate ground that is solid for half the year and unstable for the other half. Permafrost underlies much of the region. It is not simply frozen soil but a layer of earth that has remained below freezing for thousands of years. Buildings must be raised above it. Roads crack when it shifts. Traditional knowledge accounts for it implicitly. To understand Siberia as only a place of suffering is inaccurate. It is better understood as a place where survival depends on precision. The cold does not overwhelm suddenly. It asserts itself gradually, predictably, and without exception. Human presence in Siberia predates written history. Archaeological evidence shows that people occupied parts of southern Siberia more than 40,000 years ago, surviving repeated glacial periods. Over time, distinct cultures developed across the region, each shaped by geography, climate, and available resources. Indigenous groups such as the Evenki, Nenets, Chukchi, and Sakha adapted to different zones. Some followed reindeer herds across tundra. Others settled along rivers, relying on fishing, hunting, and seasonal migration. Their survival strategies were not improvised. They were inherited systems, refined across generations. Clothing was central. Animal skins were selected, layered, and stitched to trap heat and block wind. Footwear was designed to remain flexible at extreme temperatures. Shelter was portable or semi-permanent, depending on lifestyle. Fire was managed carefully, with fuel conserved and ignition methods protected from moisture and cold. Movement followed known patterns. Rivers served as routes in summer and winter. Forests provided cover and materials but also posed navigational risks. Orientation depended on landmarks, weather, and memory rather than instruments. In the 17th century, Russian expansion brought new populations into Siberia. Fur traders, explorers, and later settlers established outposts along major rivers. These settlements were not placed for comfort but for access. They relied on supply chains that were seasonal and unreliable. Failure to prepare for winter could be fatal. By the 20th century, Siberia held labor camps, industrial towns, and scientific stations. Many residents arrived involuntarily. Others came for work, drawn by mining, forestry, or state assignments. Survival in these contexts depended less on traditional knowledge and more on institutional systems that were often inadequate. Across all periods, the common factor was adaptation. Those who lived here learned to treat cold as a fixed condition, not an obstacle to overcome. The environment did not reward resilience alone. It required compliance with its limits. For most people who encounter Siberia, the cold is anticipated but not fully understood. Temperatures below freezing are familiar in many parts of the world. What distinguishes this region is not the presence of cold, but its duration and depth. There is a point each year when winter ceases to fluctuate and becomes fixed. This shift occurs in late autumn, when daylight shortens rapidly and the ground releases the last of its stored heat. Rivers slow and then stop. Snowfall becomes permanent. At this stage, mistakes narrow. Distances that were manageable weeks earlier become decisive. Mechanical failure becomes more likely. Human error becomes less forgiving. Historically, the point of no return often arrived without drama. A delayed journey. A misjudged supply calculation. An assumption that conditions would remain tolerable for a few more days. In Siberia, those margins are thin. Once sustained deep cold sets in, options contract. Explorers recorded this moment in logs rather than stories. They noted temperatures that no longer rose during daylight hours. They described frost that did not retreat. Travel plans were abandoned not because of storms, but because movement itself became unsustainable. Exposure risk increased even in clear weather. For those living permanently in the region, this transition marked a change in routine. Work shifted indoors. Travel slowed or stopped. Food and fuel consumption increased. Every action began to account for heat loss. Time outside was measured. For those unprepared or newly arrived, this was the dividing line. Beyond it, survival depended on systems already in place. There was no opportunity to build from scratch. Shelter, clothing, fuel, and food either existed or did not. This phase of winter did not announce itself. There was no single day when conditions became extreme. Instead, cold accumulated. Each morning began colder than the last. Each task required more effort. Fatigue increased. From this point forward, survival in Siberia was no longer about endurance in the abstract. It became a matter of daily management under conditions that no longer relented. The environment did not escalate. It stabilized at a level that demanded constant attention. Once winter stabilized, daily life in Siberia reorganized around the cold rather than against it. Survival did not depend on heroic effort. It depended on reducing unnecessary exposure and maintaining a narrow band of internal heat. Everything else followed from that requirement. Shelter became the primary environment. Whether a wooden house, a tent of hides, or a prefabricated structure, its function was the same. It had to conserve heat, block wind, and allow controlled ventilation. Open flames were managed carefully. Smoke could not accumulate. Fuel had to last. Inside, movement was limited. Tasks were grouped to minimize transitions between warmth and cold. Clothing was adjusted gradually to avoid sweating, which could be dangerous. Moisture trapped in fabric froze quickly and drew heat away from the body. Time outside was purposeful. Water was collected from ice holes or melted indoors. Fuel was hauled in short intervals. Animals were checked quickly. Hands were protected even during brief exposure. Metal tools were handled through cloth or wood to prevent skin contact. The body adapted to a steady drain of heat. Caloric intake increased. Diets emphasized fat and protein, not variety. Hunger was managed predictably. Weight loss was common but monitored. Weakness was not ignored, as it could signal a breakdown in routine. Mental discipline mattered. Days were structured to avoid stagnation. Repetition provided stability. In isolation, people marked time through tasks rather than dates. The goal was not comfort but equilibrium. Cold altered perception. Sounds sharpened. The air felt heavier. Small failures, like a cracked container or damp gloves, had outsized consequences. These were corrected immediately. Nothing was deferred. Living inside extreme cold required acceptance. There was no expectation of relief. The temperature was treated as a constant, like gravity. Survival was not about waiting for winter to end. It was about functioning correctly while it continued. Food and fuel determined the limits of survival more precisely than temperature alone. In Siberia, cold did not kill directly as often as depletion did. When supplies fell out of balance, the consequences followed predictably. Fuel came first. Wood, dung, coal, or stored oil had to be available in quantities calculated weeks in advance. Burning too much created risk later. Burning too little created risk immediately. Fires were kept low and steady. Embers were preserved overnight. Ignition tools were protected as critical equipment. Food was selected for density rather than preference. Traditional diets relied on fish, meat, rendered fat, and dried provisions. Fresh food was rare in winter but not absent. Frozen meat could be stored outdoors without spoilage. Fish were harvested through ice and consumed quickly or preserved. Preparation was simple. Cooking minimized waste. Bones were reused for broth. Nothing edible was discarded. The act of eating was functional, timed to maintain energy rather than pleasure. Routine imposed order. Mornings followed the same sequence. Fires were checked. Water was secured. Equipment was inspected for frost damage. Clothing was dried incrementally to prevent freezing. Even small repairs were done immediately, because materials became brittle and failures compounded. Movement outside followed fixed paths. Snow was compacted intentionally. Deviation increased risk of falling, losing footing, or damaging footwear. At extreme cold, injury recovery slowed significantly. Avoidance mattered more than treatment. Isolation intensified reliance on routine. Without external reference points, repetition anchored attention. People counted days by completed cycles rather than calendars. Disruption caused stress, not because of surprise, but because it threatened stability. These systems were not unique to one group or period. They appeared in indigenous camps, remote settlements, labor sites, and research stations alike. The specifics varied, but the logic remained consistent. Survival in Siberia depended on managing inputs and outputs with little margin for error. When these systems held, life continued. When they failed, decline followed without delay. Endurance in Siberia was not a test of will in isolation. It was the outcome of systems that reduced strain over time. People who survived long winters did not push themselves harder. They learned how to require less. Physical movement was minimized but not eliminated. Complete inactivity led to stiffness, weakness, and cold intolerance. Light, regular work kept circulation active. Tasks were rotated to avoid exhaustion. Rest was scheduled, not improvised. Sleep followed the rhythm of light rather than clocks. During deep winter, darkness dominated. Artificial light was used sparingly. Extended rest periods were common. This was not seen as idleness, but as conservation. The body's demand for energy increased in cold, and recovery took longer. Mental endurance was treated indirectly. People avoided focusing on duration. Winter was not counted in weeks remaining. Attention stayed on immediate tasks. This reduced anxiety and prevented anticipation from becoming burden. Isolation altered cognition. Sensory input narrowed. The environment changed little from day to day. To counter this, people maintained simple markers of progress: repaired tools, stacked fuel, prepared food. These visible results reinforced continuity. Social structures, where present, followed similar logic. Interaction was limited but deliberate. Conflict was avoided because it drained energy. Silence was not considered absence. It was neutral. Failures occurred most often when systems were interrupted. Illness reduced mobility. Injury disrupted routine. Equipment failure forced improvisation. At extreme cold, improvisation was dangerous. Solutions had to be proven, not creative. Those who endured did so by recognizing limits early. When signs of decline appeared, persistent fatigue, loss of appetite, impaired coordination, activity was reduced. Pride had no place in these decisions. Endurance here was not a dramatic arc. It was a flat line maintained through constant correction. Survival was not achieved once. It was achieved repeatedly, each day, by keeping systems intact under conditions that never eased.